Mr. PondBoss, tell me what to do to make all my Lunker Lake dreams come true.
Hello everybody, Bob Lusk. Let's talk about fish. So Bay said, talk about how structure helps grow big bass. And then sedentary versus marathon fish. And regular fish versus jumpers. So all those topics are very timely. So let's talk about how structure helps grow big bass. Here's how that works. When you have the right amount of habitat in a lake, that helps increase productivity of the water. Now this gets a little tedious to explain, but let me hit it. Think about fish hatcheries, for example. They don't want any structure, no habitat. They want fertile water, good spawns, and high survival rates of their young of the year fish. That's what they want. But keep in mind, they're growing one species of fish, typically. They might be growing bass or bluegills or yellow perch or whatever they're growing in that pond. Like Ron Chrisman up in Michigan, his mission is to grow as many smallmouth bass as he can, but he's also got a couple of ponds where he's got mixed species. So that's more of a predator-prey relationship, and if you've got the right habitat for all those species of fish and you got the right food chain, they're going to do pretty good. The habitat is going to be based on the species you've got and what your mission is. So when Bay's asking talk about growing really big bass with the right kind of structure, what that means to guys like me is we want the right kind of underwater communities where fish can reproduce, not go very far, to be able to hide and loaf and not get eaten too fast. But just beyond that, you've got the kind of structure that's really attractive to bass or, walleye or whatever your predator fish are. You've got the kind of structure that's attractive to them. And since Bay asked about largemouth bass, what that means is ambush points. So like Bay put some mossback fish habitat in his lake in 3 different places or 4 different places. And 2 of those places are lined up parallel to the shore where there's spawning beds, and then there's some brush and some stick-ups of terrestrial weeds and other like little willow saplings and things where little bitty fish can congregate. And then when you move out into deeper water, that's where the big bass like to hang out and ambush their prey. Now the thing about Bay's Lake is he's also got threadfin shad, gizzard shad, and tilapia. So his bass don't really have to go very far to be able to chow down and have a good meal. And when the question he's asking about sedentary versus marathon fish, we did a study, gosh, holy cow, it's been 20 years ago now, where I had the pleasure to work with a PhD student out of South Dakota State University on a project that I had developed for about 5 or 6 years up to that point. And he radio tagged 40 largemouth bass from 2 pounds up to 7 pounds. And this was a 125-acre lake in East Texas. Then he used telemetry to monitor the movement patterns of all these fish. Now, he didn't track every fish every day. He would zero in on a handful of fish and watch their movements on any given point in time. But what he found out was, like that 7-pound bass relative weight never did get above about 95. But that 7-pound female bass would move almost 2 miles every day. That fish was a marathon runner. So part of the study was determining whether or not to add some habitat to congregate bass and make them or give them the opportunity to be more sedentary so they didn't expend so much energy moving and they could get bigger. That was the premise. So they worked with Andy Benson with Mossback, and I got to work on that as well. And they built, that's where Andy really came up with the concept of fish cities. Now, he'd already been working on that idea, but he got to put it in practice. And what we learned from after putting some fish cities in there during this study, that there were some of those tagged bass that would come to the fish cities and they'd hang out there a long, long time. But those fish that were marathon runners, that was their genetics and their conditioning in that lake, and they didn't change. So that 7-pound bass never really got much bigger than 7 pounds. I don't know how many times it was recovered, but I know he tracked it for 18 months. And he might have recovered it once or twice. I don't remember that particular study. But, one of the goals to grow big bass is to make them expend the least amount of energy possible to eat. So that means providing them ambush cover, ambush structure, where they can hang out, hide out, and then not have to go very far to get a full meal deal like a number one at McDonald's for those kind of fish. So the marathon runners, they're burning energy all the time because they're moving. Just to kind of give you another point about this, out of those 40 fish, there was one fish that never left an area any bigger than a football field in a 125-acre lake. But that marathon runner bass, that one in particular, would move 2 miles a day, and it was random. When I first started hearing about it through the PhD student back then, he was telling me that there was what I thought was that fish had a trap line. It would go from here to there, to there, to there, to there, to there. Didn't do that. It might run from one end of the lake to the other, sit there for 30 minutes, and then go right back to where it was, and then go across the lake, and then back down the lake. It was random. It was not. There was no methodology behind the way that fish was moving at all. Where other fish seemed to have some method. They would go from this ambush point to that ambush point to that ambush point. And so that was a very, very interesting study. So here's what that means to us. If we can provide the right kind of ambush cover, some of the fish are going to take advantage of that. Especially if we can provide the food chain with happy water to entice that fish to not have to leave that structure, because fish don't have the ability to learn. They react based on instinct and conditioning. And providing big structure to grow big bass assists in that conditioning. If they can orient to that structure and not have to leave it, and their food's not that far away, then they're going to use it. So therein lies part of the strategy as to how we try to decide where to put artificial structure. Like in Bay's Lake, for example, this is something that Virgil's going to appreciate. The very first thing we did, Bay called me in November, said, "Hey, I'm buying this ranch. It's got a great lake on it. I'd like to figure out what to do with it." So I went out with him and looked at it, and it was a windy day. He says, "You want to get on the lake?" "No, I don't." It was in November. It was cold, and I didn't want to fight whitecaps on a 100-acre private lake. But there were several things that struck me that day. One thing that struck me that I had no idea why it was going on, I do now, I didn't then, was that lake had a good bloom, Jeremy Day. You're asking about that. That lake, looking at it, the green colored water in November was not characteristic of what I'm used to seeing on lakes in November in Texas. Typically, the water's got more of a tannic look to it. It's the clarity's higher, but he had a 24-inch bloom. And I mean, that water looked great. And I knew it wasn't pigment. It wasn't because of the minerals dissolved. There was a living plankton bloom going on in that lake when the water temperature was in the upper 50s, which that piqued my curiosity some. So then, the first thing I said, most of the time I'll say, we need to go analyze the fishery. Let's see what kind of fish you got. As I looked at that lake, the first thing that struck me is we need a bathymetry map. We need to see how this lake is shaped as it is and what does the bottom of it look like. Because, part of my thought process was, how in the world can a lake have a bloom like that? Why isn't it choked with aquatic plants? Because it wasn't. There's some dynamics here that we need to figure out, and I think we need to start with the bathymetry map. So that's what we did. We built a bathymetry map, and things started kind of jumping out at me. The deepest water at that point was like 13 feet deep. And I think it's 13 feet deep at the deepest when the lake is at full pool. Maybe 15 feet. I think 13 and a half feet deep is the deepest. But then as I studied the contours, it was very clear what was going on. When it would rain and water would flow, there's still a distinct creek channel that meanders, comes down one side of the lake, cuts across the lake to the near shore, and then circles back around and goes out toward the dam where water overflows. So it started. So then we electrofished it in December, I don't electrofish lakes in Texas in December, but he'd closed on the ranch. We needed to see what he had. I was amazed at the things that we found, and I started, as I thought about it, I mean, when I'm working on a lake that's 100 acres and there's channel catfish in it, we'll find one or two maybe in December. You know, typically we'll find most of what's in the lake, but not many in December. Oh my gosh, that first time we went out, I think we shot 2 days back to back. We shot 66 channel catfish, over 75 bass, bunch of crappie, carp, and gizzard shad, and crappie, quite a few crappie. So then it started kind of registering with me, and I kept 40 of those channel catfish to give to a guy, to a butcher, because he donates them to people that are hungry. Well, I brought those fish home. I couldn't find the guy. And then when I finally found him, he said, no, I don't want all of them, because he was going to butcher them and he didn't have time. So I said, well, heck, I'm going to clean these fish. Well, I cleaned them, and there's two things that struck me immediately. Number one was they had yellow fat along their backbones. And the second thing was their guts were full of black detritus looking stuff. And as I dug into it, I think I butchered all 40 fish, something like that. And there were pieces of willow leaves. 4 of them had a bluegill in it, which that made sense to me. But what didn't make sense to me was all the black stuff. And then I started thinking about it. I thought, oh my gosh, those fish have run out of food. They've overeaten the food chain with the bass, with the crappie, and the channel catfish as predators. And now they've gone up in the shallow areas where all the stick-ups are. Stick-ups meaning in that lake a bunch of terrestrial weeds where the lake had dropped several feet. Weeds grew up. The lake flooded the weeds. The leaves fell off, and the catfish were eating that stuff. Which channel catfish will do that. You know, they don't want to die. They want to eat. You know, they want to grow. Well, I noticed that their relative weights were lower than they should be. And then it hit me. The yellow fat came from eating a lot of vegetation. So then I started saying, okay, wait a minute. We got gizzard shad. We got carp. Those are bottom feeders. They're feeding on the same stuff these channel catfish are. And channel catfish are not scavengers, believe it or not. They're predator fish, but they're kind of like teenage boys. They're going to go to the refrigerator. They're going to look for meat. If there's no meat, they have to eat broccoli and cheese. They'll eat broccoli and cheese. That's channel catfish. And so as I started analyzing it some, I started thinking, wait a minute, you know, those fish were up in water 5 feet, 4 feet deep in December feeding. Not totally normal. Well, the yellow fat tells me that they've been feeding on vegetation quite a bit because they store that as yellow fat. You know, so that made me think, okay, they've been doing this for several months. Those fish are competing with all the other game fish and overeating the food chain. So that's when we started coming up with a game plan where we needed to harvest as many of those fish as we could get. We needed to take out carp, needed to take out channel catfish, and crappie, because Bay's goal is to grow some really big bass in as big numbers as we can. And as we studied the bathymetry map, here's where I'm circling back to the structure thing, is the lake didn't have nearly the amount of bass attractive cover as it should have. So that's when I got on the phone and called Andy and said, hey, Andy, come over here. Let's go take a look at this lake. And Andy brought his bass boat. He caught a bass that over 10 pounds and a 9-pound bass. I think that was in, Bay might correct me, but I think that was in January. He came over twice. And so that's when we started figuring out, how do we place this structure? What are the areas? And Bay had several things. You know, one thing is his daughter likes to ride a jet ski, so don't put anything where she could get hurt. Check. So we started looking, and as we thought about these different areas, we saw some areas where the fish like to congregate anyway. So we decided to enhance that, which is not far from fairly shallow water where fish can reproduce, and there's some other structure that goes along with it. So that's how we started kind of coming up with the ideas of adding structure. So what's going to be fun to watch is how that structure enhances the lake's ability to produce more fish. Now, when I say produce more fish, what I mean by that is how it can grow more fish. An angler, when I say produce more fish, you know structure is going to produce more fish for an angler because they're going to congregate the fish. But where I'm going with that is, what can we do to a lake with structure to increase and improve its ability to grow more fish. So that's where I wanted to go with that topic. So in the meantime, guys, hey, PondBoss Magazine, $35 a year, cheaper than a Friday night date in the last year. So adios for now.
Hey, Mr. PondBoss, tell me what to do to make all my lunker lake dreams come true.